Hello, and welcome to the Postmodern Iconoclast. The Postmodern Iconoclast is a podcast where I break down and destroy the false idols and icons of the digital age in search of a more authentic, esoteric spirituality. And in this episode, I will be doing another solo episode, so it'll just be me talking and sharing things. Because in this episode, I'm actually going to be doing more of a story time type conversation where I go through some of my memories as an occultist in the occult scene and share insight into what my life has been like as an occultist. And specifically in this episode, I'm going to be talking about the years I lived in New York City and was involved in the local occult community in New York City. So, for those who do not know, there is a sort of subculture within New York City of occultists who have various kind of spread apart groups. And I was quite involved with this in the years I lived in New York. I lived in New York City for a bit over 5 years of my life. And I moved away from New York City this past May. So I was there for a pretty long time. Now, some of those years were during the coronavirus pandemic. So obviously, the occult scene during my years I was there during COVID was a bit different. But I was there some before COVID and some after COVID when things were somewhat normal. So thankfully, I did get, quite a few years of like normal New York City life and not all like being cramped in my studio apartment years. But before I get into the actual conversation, I would like to mention that I am hosting a group trip with Trova Trip to Greece. There are still spots available, so please sign up. It'll be in the show notes or description below. Oh, also one more thing. I do need to say this because I am going to be talking about, and I did say the location, I am going to be talking about the occult scene in New York City, which are real groups and real people. So for that reason, I know this will be really annoying to people who live in New York who know what these groups are. But for people's privacies, I will not be sharing anyone's name, even if I know they are like scene names. Because the thing you'll see in like occult communities, I saw this a fair amount in New York, especially in the Wiccan groups, people would have like scene names where they would basically like have a name they would use at the occult community that wasn't their real name for various reasons. The other term for this is magical names, though magical names are kind of more ones that have like a spiritual context to them. Some people's names they used had a spiritual concept. Some of them were just like privacy things. So I'm not going to be sharing anyone's names, including their like occult community names. I'm also not going to be sharing the names of groups. I'm going to be describing them. If you know enough about the occult community to figure out what I am talking about, I would really, if you are listening to this on YouTube, refrain from naming groups below, just because I really want to respect everyone's privacy and information. I don't want this podcast to start issues or drama this isn't a drama podcast. I'm literally just going to be sharing my stories. Like, there's no drama in this if that's what you're looking for. Like, this is not some juicy expose. This is just me going through some of my memories and talking about my evolution. But just so that, everyone's protected and nobody can get upset by any of this, I will be hiding private information, but I'll be telling as much as I can without actually like revealing people's stuff on the internet. Because you see, I signed up to be a public figure. These people who run these groups did not. And a lot of these groups are even hard to find on the internet. So yeah, without further ado, I am going to start actually getting into the conversation, which is what people actually care about. So before New York City, I feel like I should give a little bit of background so people know what I was coming from when I moved to New York City. Also, warning, my dog is eating her breakfast out of her food bowl. So you might hear some weird noises, but I apologize for that. Basically, before I moved to New York City, I did a whole podcast where I talked about my early occult experiences. That's on my channel and on my podcast. So listen to that if you want more details. But the TLDR of that is I started out kind of interested in witchy folk magic stuff after a really hard period in my life. And it was unsatisfying to me because I wanted a why occultism works. And so I discovered Thelema, which is the magical system created by Aleister Crowley, because it had the idea of true will and the great work, and it had like a linear progression, which gave me structure. Because as a person, I am someone who needs structure and I need reasons why I'm doing things or I go a little bit mad. And being part of an occult system where no one was telling me why I was doing this stuff, it was just like magic willy-nilly, like that just didn't work with my brain. I needed an explanation. I needed to know why magic works. You know what I mean? And so Thelema really, really, really appealed to me. But despite that, I still did do quite a few practices that were not within Thelema proper. I never was someone who solely did stuff like Crowley came up with that was never my thing. I was very, very much a Thelemite at this time, though, and I would totally have identified that as my religion, right? Like, I was considering getting the unicursal hexagram tattooed on me, right? I was full in. I was locked into Thelema. And now, for a little bit more context, I am kind of a Thelemite. I would say less so than I was. Most of my actual practical magic that I do, like my actual rituals, are not Thelemic rituals. They are other ceremonial magic rituals. But the idea of true will and a lot of the like philosophy and explanations as to why magic work, I still do have a strong Thelemic bent to, despite I probably count more as a perennialist now, but there is still a lot of Thelema influence on my path today. But back then, I was even more Thelemic than I am now. And so the thing I was really looking for when I moved to New York City, so prior to living in New York City, I had kind of lived in two places my whole life. I had lived in Appalachia, which is where I grew up. I'm originally from Appalachia. I'm Scotch-Irish, ethnically, and my family are all Appalachians. And I currently, after leaving New York City, moved back to Appalachia because I miss this place so much. But besides Appalachia, the only other place I had lived was like rural, the rural Midwest near the lakes. Once again, I want to be vague just for my own privacy. But I lived for a little while up far north in the Midwest, right around the Great Lakes. I was basically in Canada. But those were the only two places I'd ever lived, and both of those are not major cities, right? Like, I don't live, like, when I say I live in Appalachia, I don't live in, like, the absolute, like, I joke that I live in the absolute middle of the woods. Like, I do live, like, in a town, right? Like, there are people where I live. There's a community, but it's not a major city, right? To claim that is crazy. It's, like, more of a population center in Appalachia, but in general, like, nobody lives in Appalachia. It's a very sparsely populated region. So I do live like in a center where there's a lot of population, but it's still like it's a smaller town, especially compared to New York. And when I lived in Michigan, I lived in like a rural area. Like I literally lived in the middle of nowhere. So when I moved to New York City, it was a huge change of pace because I had never lived in a major city. Like it was nothing like I was used to. And it was very, very exciting. Like the reason why I moved to New York was for opportunity because in truth, while I love Appalachia, it's my like favorite place in the world. I love living here. There's not a lot of opportunity. Like it's a beautiful place, but there are definitely some like issues. Like I would say Appalachia is very neglected by the US government. Like they don't really give a shit about us. And so, if you leave Appalachia, which a lot of people do, a lot of people who grow up here do leave. There's more opportunities. Like there are opportunities down here, but it's not what it could be. And there's a lot of socioeconomic, I mean, really just the government doesn't care, right? So as much as I love Appalachia, and I do definitely have a romantic view of it, like there are some actual problems here, specifically with like just like finding things to do. And anyway, so I moved to New York just to basically like have more options with my life. And the big city also appealed to me, right? It was nothing like I had ever experienced, right? It was exciting. You could see all the lights and the people, and I mean, as much as people crap on cities, like there's something cool about them, right? Like there's so many people, there's so much to do. There's a lot of like cultural things that I could have never experienced otherwise. And so moving to the city was something I had wanted to do for a long time, and I did it. I packed up and moved. And at the time, I was a hardcore Thelemite. Like that was what I was doing. Now, of course, I was not as Thelemic as some other people, right? I didn't do like Crowley Mass. Like I would do that with friends when I lived in New York occasionally, but like I didn't venerate Crowley in the way some Thelemites do. And even when I was the most Thelemic, I still actually had some critiques of Aleister Crowley. I've always said he's a human, not a messiah. And I said that when I was like the most Thelemic. And I feel very strongly about that. I think that people really treat Crowley in a way that Crowley isn't. And this is one of my like beefs that I honestly have with Thelema, actually. Like, I think people really fixate on Crowley in a way that he's not meant to be fixated on. Like, I don't know. I don't like the way people treat Crowley, and I never really have. And so while I was a Thelemite, I was not as nutty as some people are about it. And yeah, I mean, it wasn't that level, but I was still very hardcore Thelemic. Like, I did Thelemic rituals every single day. I actually did Liber-Resh, okay? A lot of Thelemites say they do Liber-Resh and have literally never done Liber-Resh, but I actually did it, and I would wake up in the morning to do it. I did the Star Ruby instead of the LBRP most of the time. I did a lot. Like, I was, doing a lot of things Thelemites work towards. And so for me, as a young Thelemite, right? I wanted to meet other Thelemites because I'm just gonna be real. I've never met a Thelemite in a small area. Like, they exist because I see them on the internet and whatnot, but like, to find a Thelemic community, you actually do have to be in a bigger city. I think the closest one to me now is probably Raleigh, North Carolina, or DC. And both of those, like where I live now, like I live in the Virginia Blue Ridge, that's a drive, right? Those are both a long ways away. And there are some in like smaller cities that have like Thelemic communities, but where I was living previously, like there was no Thelemic community in either of those places. And New York has multiple Thelemic communities, right? There's not just one, actually. Like, a lot of people know of the main Thelemic community, right? The main order that is in New York City. But there are actually several others. To my knowledge, there are at least 4 Thelema groups in New York City that I can think of off the top of my head. I'm sure there are more than that, but there are 4 that like publicly advertise themselves and recruit and bring people in. So 4 main ones. There's one that is like the big Thelemic group in New York City, though. The other ones are much smaller. And what I observed, okay, over my time living there and being involved with people who are Thelemites, is a lot of those smaller Thelema groups, not all of them, but a couple of them had broken off due to like internal drama, is what I've heard. Now, I don't know the things that I know that are part of it. I'm not going to share, but whatever else I know, like there's stuff that I don't know about that. But I know that there are like these other Thelema groups besides the main ones. A lot of them were created due to drama. I mean, some of them due to dramas that seem actually kind of legitimate, and others that seem a bit like maybe you're the problem. So just be aware of that. But basically, yes, I contacted the main Thelema group first because that made the most sense to me. I'm like, this is the one I've heard of the most. And honestly, the other ones don't advertise themselves as much. You kind of have to like go to an occult store or go on the internet or whatever. Like, the main one, people all just know about it. So easily, I just find their website, I see an email, and I just sent them an email. The big way that I contacted occult groups that I would go to is through email. Most occult groups that have stuff on the internet, which not all of them do, I'll get into that in a bit. Like, a lot of occult groups do not list their stuff on the internet and are actually very hard to find. And some of them you'll only know about when you actually start going to other occult groups and hearing about it. But the ones that are publicly listed are typically the ones that new people go to, right? Because most new people are not like aware of these like niche, tiny groups, right? Most new people know about the main groups that post the most on the internet. And I've been to all of the main groups that post the most on the internet in New York City, right? The ones that are easy to find, I've been to. Basically, I contact the main Thelema group, I email them, and I, pretty quickly was, they asked me like a few questions, I think. I'm pretty sure they emailed me back. I don't know if they asked me questions exactly, but I know whatever the fuck they sent me, I had like a back and forth email chain with them for several emails. And I had like just moved to New York. I was a little baby occultist basically. And yeah, they did allow me to come. It was an open event that I went to. I went to a Gnostic Mass, which is like a central Thelemic ritual. It's kind of like a church service for Thelema. It represents like all the major parts of the Thelemic mysteries. And most people who are Thelemites, the first main group ritual they will go to will be the Gnostic Mass. And if you join any Thelemic group, while they might not always call it the Gnostic Mass, they may have some other word for it, you're going to be going to this service a lot. It's a big part of Thelema in the group form. Now, if you are not a group Thelemite and you are a solitary Thelemite, which is actually, from my knowledge, the majority of Thelemites are not like group Thelemites, right? Like, what I've noticed, most of them aren't. The Gnostic Mass is going to be less of a thing. There are some like single Mass Thelema rituals. Specifically, I've noticed that people who are not like members of group Thelema tend to do this thing called the Mass of the Phoenix. There is, and I'm going to mention this once I start talking about things, there are some Thelemites who are like kind of satellite people to groups. who are not really heavy members but show up occasionally. And I would say in a lot of ways I was kind of a satellite to a lot of groups. But basically, yeah, so I show up, I go to the Gnostic Mass, and I remember they sent me these instructions to find the building. And they were like the spookiest instructions ever. It was like, it wasn't like this is our address. It was like you get off at this train stop and then walk to this block and sit at this bench. Like it was like really, really specific. And at the time, totally spooked by it, but I thought it was so cool. I was like, ooh, I'm actually getting like a mystery experience. Like I'm going to the secret society and they've given me like these like cryptic instructions. I really felt like the first time I went, like I was new to New York. I didn't know where anything was. Like I did this, by the way. I emailed this group before I even like put my boxes down in my apartment in New York City. Like I had contacted them like it was one of the first things I wanted to do when I confirmed I was moving and had like my dates and where I was going to go. So it was no request. I had no idea where I was going, and I hadn't even been in the part of New York City where this was. So super spooky, super fun, and yeah, it was really cool. Like the first experience was super, super cool. I really enjoyed the Gnostic Mass. I still enjoy Gnostic Mass as a ritual. I wish I could go occasionally. Like it's a really good rite if you're interested in Thelema or ceremonial magic in general. I think there's a lot that can be learned from it, and it's just cool. So this was my first time ever meeting other occultists in person. So I had only met people who were like witchy. I had never met like an actual ceremonial magician until this day. So I'm obviously nervous as hell. Like I just never met these people. And like this had been my obsession for my entire teenage years. Like occultism has always been so important to me. And occultism just had recently, a few years prior, gotten me out of like one of the worst periods of my entire life. And so I was just off the walls excited to meet these people. And it was really cool. I had a great experience. And I went back to that group several times. Like it was not like I went to this one time and then dropped it. And the people in that group were very nice. Now they were a lot older than me. Okay, I remember thinking this at the time. And in general, when I was involved in the occult scene, I was very young. And obviously you have to be an adult to be involved in the occult scene. And so very consistently, I was the youngest person at events, like by a pretty decent margin. Like right before I left New York, I started seeing people my age or younger, but that was like the last year. Like until then, I was almost always the youngest person. Like pretty much everyone else was like 27 plus. Like I wouldn't even say like around late 20s, early 30s. Like a lot of people were like significantly older. They were like 40s, 50s, 60s, and so on. Which really shows that the occult is not like some like teenage edgy goth trend, because I was literally the youngest person. Like I think for years I was maybe the only Gen Z person involved in the New York City occult scene. Like, and that was so interesting because obviously online, when you look at the occult online, right, you're seeing a lot of really, really young people. I mean, I'm now like old on the internet, okay? I'm 23. I may as well like pack up my things and go to the old folks' home at this point, compared to some of the kids on the occult internet. Like some of them are literally probably like 16, like, which is not good. I think people can be occultists at 16 and like start their practice as a teenager. I started my practice as a teenager. Like there's nothing wrong with that, but I don't think you should be posting on the internet as a minor. That's just my own opinion with what I've experienced as a content creator. And I've had some real rough times on the internet as a content creator. So I definitely don't think that's healthy for a teenager to be doing. But being a teenage occultist is totally fine. Like if you're listening to me and you're a teenager, which is not many people in my audience, based on my little data I get, most people who listen to me are late 20s. That's like the majority. But yeah, if you're super young and you're listening to this, yeah, like you're totally cool to do that, but I wouldn't start like posting on the internet about it just for your personal safety. But yeah, I was the youngest. Like it was shocking to me. I expected, like I didn't think everyone would be my age, right? I didn't think everyone would be like 18, 19, 20, 21, right? That's not, because that's how old I was at the time, okay? I'm now older than that. But back then that's where my age range was. But I did expect more people my age. I was surprised. Like I remember I just looked around and I was like, whoa, I'm like way younger than everyone. I'm like a little baby. And pretty consistently, the first few years I was in the occult scene and people would ask me my age, they would be surprised I was as young as I was. Like, this started to happen on the internet when I became an occultist too, but less so, because the internet has always skewed young. But yeah, I mean, it was just, it veered older. And so in terms of like close personal connections, there was always a bit of a disconnect between me and a lot of people just because we didn't have a lot to relate on, right? The only thing we had in common was occultism. Like I couldn't relate to a lot of the things they would talk about when they weren't talking about occultism. Like I didn't understand their media references. You know what I mean? Like, it was just, there was a generational gap, and like their life experiences they were going through were not the life experiences I was going through. So yeah, that was always a bit of a disconnect. And so generally, when it comes to the way I engaged with the occult community, there was always a little bit of distance because it was hard for me to develop super personal friendships with these people just because of the age gap thing. Now, there were some people who I did develop actual personal relationships with, who I did get very close with. So it's not like I was like that with everyone, but there were only a couple people that I actually got very close to. The rest of people I was a bit more distant from just because of all those reasons. Doesn't say anything about them as people. They're all lovely people. It's just there weren't a lot of young people. And that's surprising. I think in general, there is a bit of a disconnect between younger occultists and older occultists. And by younger, I'm going to say sub 30. 30 years old and under is going to be my younger group. And then about 30 and up is going to be my older group. 30s and under tend to be way more eclectic, and I noticed this once I started getting involved with some other groups, whereas 30 plus tend to be very much in groups, and they tend to be Thelemites or Wiccans. You see a lot less like ideological diversity, I guess, when you look older, whereas if you look younger, I mean, really, people are kind of doing their own thing. There's an interesting conversation to be had as if like internet occultism has become its own religion or tradition in of itself, because in a way it kind of has, because the way that even I, someone who seeks like order and structure, like I'm a structure seeker, I'm still way more eclectic than like anyone older than me. Like when I was around these Thelemites, like I was always more eclectic. Like that was just very consistent because I had started online and I had started solitary. And also every time I engaged with a group occult scene, I always had a strong solitary practice. And so I actually identified as a solitary practitioner first, even when I was involved with these groups and was doing rituals with them. I still consider myself a solitary practitioner first because so much of my practice was done alone and so many of my spiritual experiences were happening by myself. Now, as I spent more time with this Thelema group, I got more close with them, and that age disconnect was less of a thing. And I developed a real relationship with them, and I went to a lot of classes. One of my favorite things to do in the in-person occult scene, and if you live in a major city, go to these, is classes. So people would come and they would teach classes on different things, and some of it would be like with the Thelema group I was involved with a bit. Like it would be sometimes on Thelema stuff, sometimes on other things. It was really interesting when they did other stuff besides main Thelema stuff because you could hear like some really interesting stuff. I remember specifically there was like a Sumerian magic lecture at one point that I went to that was just so cool. Yeah, just really cool stuff. As well, this Thelema group did a lot of stuff for like Thelemic holidays and seasonal stuff. And one thing that was always cool is during a lot of the like solstice and equinox stuff, like they would have this person come in from a traditional witchcraft, like a tradcraft coven, and lead some rituals, which would be a whole style of ritual like I was completely like alien to. Like it was so different. And so that was always really cool. And I had a good experience with this group mostly. I was never heavily involved. I was never super committed to it. But I did go occasionally. There's a term that I have coined in my head that I'm sure someone else has said. I highly doubt I've come up with some genius new idea here, called like a satellite occultist. So satellite occultist is someone who's fundamentally a solitary practitioner but goes to group rituals occasionally and doesn't tend to really join groups properly. They just kind of show up occasionally for ritual, which is definitely where I was. I heavily practice the occult. I do rituals every single day of my life and have done rituals every single day of my life since I was a teenager. And do major rituals like all the time. But in terms of like group involvement, I was never as group involved as a lot of other people are, just because I'm so used to it, right? When you start your practice as a solitary practitioner and you start moving towards doing group rituals, it's a huge paradigm shift. And I have had more success with solitary ritual, but I've had some incredible group experiences. Now, talking about some other groups I interacted with, because I didn't just interact with this one Thelema group, is I actually went to a Wiccan group. So a lot of the groups online that were heavily advertised were Wiccan. Now, the first Wiccan group I went to did the rituals in a public park, and they definitely had a different approach than me. I'm not a Wiccan, but I wanted to test out like the different groups in the cities and try to have as many experiences as possible. You guys can't tell I'm high on openness. And this group I really didn't relate to at all. They were they skewed like very old, and they had a very kind of light Wicca type approach. I think they were technically, they weren't to my knowledge, though I could be wrong, they didn't seem particularly like trad Gardnerian Wicca. I'm not sure. But they definitely felt a little eclectic. But there was still like that heavy Wiccan structure. Like these people were Wiccans proper. And the ritual, it just didn't click with me. This has nothing to do with them. Like, I just didn't relate to it. It just wasn't my thing. I did go a couple other times to see if that was like really me or like, maybe this just isn't, my vibe. And it very much wasn't my vibe. Like, I learned pretty quickly that like standard Wicca was not my thing. It was an interesting experience. I'm glad I tried it, but it was totally not for me. And there was one time though. Okay, this is the best memory I have going to that group a couple times. Was we were doing this full moon ritual because they did rituals like every full moon and every new moon, and then like the Sabbats. So basically, I was there and we were doing the full moon ritual, and this little squirrel in the park like walked up to us and sat still and like watched the entire ritual and didn't move until the ritual ended. And so it was like, oh, we found a little witch squirrel. Like that was just such a cute moment. Definitely one of the like best moments from my time in New York City as an occultist. It was just so, so, so cool. Now, I did go to one other, I don't know if I want to call this group a Wiccan. They were Wiccan. They were trained Wiccan. They went through Wiccan like ritual initiations. I believe they had gone through Gardnerian, not Alexandrian, but they'd gone through a lot of like the Wiccan stuff. Like they were trained Wiccan, and so there was obviously heavy Wicca feel to this group. But instead of worshiping the standard god and goddess, they worshipped Hecate and Hades. And I loved this group. The problem, they were really far from where I lived. And so going regularly, it just wasn't feasible. Like it was like over an hour to get there. It was a pain in the ass. But they did really cool rituals. They did like new moon rituals, and I had some really good experiences with them. Like those people were super cool. I remember getting along with them so well. I clicked with them. They were still a lot older than me, but I totally clicked with these people. And the rituals were just so fun. And they had like a darker chthonic feel to them because for me, like I've worshipped a lot of more chthonic gods. I've worked heavily with a lot of more chthonic gods. So it was just a bit more relatable. And I liked the way they deviated from like standard traditional Wicca while still retaining the structure and form. I found that to be really cool. Like you can kind of do both, right? You don't need to just do pure traditional Wicca or pure new techniques. You can blend these things and create your own ritual tradition in a cool way. And I really learned that from that group. Also, I went to a lecture they did. They did some lectures before their like big rituals on, they did one on the LBRP, which is surprising because that's not really like within their wheelhouse. But I remember at the ritual lecture on the LBRP, the way they explained this thing called vibration, which is basically where you kind of like sing out, vibrate out, go like, like how everyone's heard like the or like in yoga. I did that really terribly. You kind of do that in some Western ceremonial magic where you like vibrate parts of the ritual. And the way they explained that was just awesome. Like it put it into perspective, and I became so much better at vibrating after this experience. It taught me a lot. Now, another thing that I went to several times and pretty regularly until this group actually just stopped meeting, like they just stopped doing it. I believe that was because of COVID and they never got back to it. I don't remember exactly how this went down or if they just quit, but there was a thing at one of the occult shops in New York City where they would do monthly full moon rituals. And these were like really eclectic. And this was so cool. I loved going to these. So basically, every month of the full moon, they would go to this occult shop, and they had like a back room to the occult shop where there would be these full moon rituals. And it was led by one of the owners of the occult shop. And the owner of the occult shop was very into like traditional witchcraft type stuff and like Greek stuff, really cool eclectic stuff. And every month there would be like a different ritual. And I learned about stuff from the Greek magical papyri from this thing. So I remember one of them specifically was a Hecate ritual where they used parts of the PGM. And it was one of the coolest rituals I've ever been to. I had such a strong reaction to it. And every month they would do all sorts of cool stuff. They used like these squares and these really old Greek invocations. And it was really cool because it was a mix of witchcraft and ceremonial magic, and it did lean a little chthonic. But it was just cool. Like every month was so different, and I learned a lot about planetary magic, which is actually the bulk of my practice now. I do a lot of planetary magic. If you follow my YouTube channel, you've been noticing I've been doing a lot of planetary magic videos recently. And I learned a lot of techniques that I would use from these rituals because since they were completely different every month, like you never really knew what you were walking into until you walked into the room and saw them starting to do the ritual. I would learn new things, and they would do this cool thing where while they were doing the rituals, because these were public rituals, this wasn't a group you could join. They were just rituals put on by an occult shop. It was not a proper group per se, though it kind of became like a little bit of a group because, of course, there were regulars that would come every month that I would get to know. And this veered very millennial. Like most people at this group were millennial or late Gen X. So while they were older than me, not by like an insane degree, they would like teach while they did the ritual. And so whenever I've done, like I during COVID did some Zoom rituals with members of my community, and I totally like learned this from them, like to teach while you're doing the rituals. People at the ritual can learn because this group it did skew a lot more like people. And actually, no, I wouldn't say that. There were quite a few beginners. Like there were more beginners compared to other groups because this was at a shop and there was no like pressure to join a group or like go through initiations or whatnot. But there were people who were a lot more experienced there. Like I would say, I almost phrased that wrong. There were a lot of very experienced people there, but there were also more newbies than others. And so obviously I had to kind of cater to the newbies a little bit. And these were a little less, so these are participatory, but not as participatory as some other rituals. Like you would do parts of it, but not all of it. And there was like a main person who kind of like led a lot of the rituals, and then you would do parts with it. And it was just really cool. I had really good experiences with this group, and yeah, they were really cool. And then at this point, like now that I'd been in the community for a while and I'd gone to a bunch of different groups, people kind of like knew who I was a bit. And so I started like actually getting like invited to private rituals. So a thing that happens in New York is people who are members of groups will unofficially, or people who just exist in New York, a lot of people weren't even in groups, people who had like been involved in the community and knew who each other were, would have private rituals like in their home, in their apartment, in parks. There were these really cool picnic meetups that I went to for a while where like people would go to a park and like have a picnic and do a ritual in the park and then have a fun picnic and hang out. That was a really cool thing that I did several times. But yeah, people would invite people to their homes, sometimes on like solstices or equinoxes, sometimes around then, sometimes randomly, like for specific like major astrological events, and they would have people into their home and people would like bring food. I remember I went to one, it was like for a solstice, like one big like potluck kind of picnicky. Potluck might be the right term. There was food. There was food. Several people brought food, and we all did a ritual, and then hung out and like sat and talked, and that was so fun. But yeah, they would have people in their homes, and these rituals were much smaller. They were not big because you can't fit that many people in your apartment, right? Like no one in New York City who is not super rich has like a massive apartment, so you were often crammed like sardines with people, but they were so fun. And you could, since they weren't in like actual groups, because most of the groups in New York City are committed to a proper tradition, right? They're part of a tradition. They're part of something particular. And when you're with people and you're not in a group setting, but you're with a group, but you're not in a group proper setting, like you're not in an order or coven. That's how I should phrase that. You can do a lot different things. You can really mix it up and do all sorts of stuff. And so I remember one that I went to that I had a really crazy spiritual experience at was at this like, it was invoking the goddess Isis of all things. Though I had an experience that had nothing to do with Isis, where I had this like full-on closed eye hallucination of this vision I had, and this would lead me down this like crazy explorative period and change my entire practice. That was crazy. Like this one ritual, whatever I saw didn't even have to do with Isis, but for some reason that ritual like opened some sort of channel or connection that I had never experienced, and it sent me on this whole like arc, right? Like a whole arc in my practice where things completely changed, my life completely changed. That ritual like changed everything, even though that wasn't an initiation ritual. And whatever I saw didn't even have to do with Isis. I'm still trying to figure out why this ritual did that. I've never fully grasped why this ritual did that, but for some reason, it just changed my practice like forever. I saw this vision that I didn't even understand. I had to do a lot of contemplation to figure out what it even meant. And that sent me on this crazy arc that was just incredible. Really, really cool stuff was opened up by that ritual. Other private rituals I went to were awesome. Like they were some of the best rituals I went to. I feel like for me in group rituals, I like a small group. I think small groups are best Because the thing is with a group ritual is when you do a group ritual, it's like everyone's energies coming together and collecting together and pooling together. And so when you have a small ritual, it's just, you know the people a bit better, and you know the people are experienced enough to be able to like add to it. So you can have really profound experiences. I would say like my ideal group ritual quantity would be like maybe like 7 people max. Like I like them small. Um, and so I had some amazing experiences in people's homes. Now, another cool thing that I did while I was in New York is I was part of this like book club that was a more like just people I knew. And we read through like some occult text together. And that was really cool because we could have like a whole discussion and it wasn't like 8 million people together. So that was really awesome. Now, one of the things that I didn't connect with, because obviously I went to a bunch of different things, and so I didn't relate to everything, is I went to some theosophy stuff. If you guys know anything about my relationship with theosophy, you guys know I don't really like theosophy. I think it's like a wacky system. I did a whole podcast talking about Rene Guénon's critiques of theosophy. He has a book on his problems with theosophy, and it's a bit of like a bitchy rant, but it's pretty good. I did not relate to any of the theosophy stuff I went to. I went to some lectures. I didn't even go to like rituals with them, but I just didn't relate. Like their lectures were not that great. They were not my thing. And yeah, I don't like theosophy. I learned that pretty quickly. I also noticed the people who went to theosophy stuff, I never saw anyone I knew from other occult groups, whereas the other groups had a lot of overlap, right? Like in the New York occult scene, despite it being a huge city, like it is kind of the same people, right? It's not a huge community despite being a huge city. And these groups have crazy crossover. I mean, everyone knows each other. Like if you mention I've gone to this, I've gone to that, like they'll know, oh yeah, I know who that is. I know who that is. Also, since it is a tight knit community, there's quite a bit of like people having opinions on other people and opinions on other groups, and some people feel very strongly about other groups. I know that there is some drama, but since I was never as close to people as some other people were, and I wasn't involved in really any in-person occult drama ever. Like I've been involved in internet occult drama. I've never actually been part of real life occult drama, but I know some of that is there. But I think that would happen with any community where you have the same few people that feel very differently about things. But yeah, Theosophy was a totally different crowd. Like I didn't recognize any of those people. It was really wild. And so that's kind of its own scene. I feel like the theosophy crowd is a theosophy crowd. And it did skew super new agey, so didn't relate. Went to a couple lectures just to see it out, and not my thing. Totally not my thing. Like it's fascinating to me how different like certain systems. It really does feel like it's just those people. So yeah, that was interesting to me. I've also heard the people who are involved with more like I kind of hate the term left hand path and right hand path. The people who are involved in more left hand pathy things kind of also keep to themselves, is what I've noticed. Those groups I have heard exist. I don't know. Haven't seen them advertised really. I know there's like the Satanic Temple, but those people are atheists, so I don't know why I would interact with them. But from what I've heard, they're kind of their own crowd, the TST people. I was never in with the TST because I'm not a Satanist. I have no interest in Satanism, and I'm super theistic. Like I believe the gods are real, so can't really speak to those type of groups. But I know they are around. I wonder if they are also. I've always assumed they're kind of like the Theosophy thing, where they kind of keep to themselves. But yeah, so that's their own little world. Now, the other random thing I went to that was really bizarre is I went to, and this is totally like a don't go. I went to this like new age Kabbalah thing, and that was so weird. So I went to this group just because they were very famous, and so I was like, okay, I'll check them out. And they were in like the nicest building ever. Like to be real, occult stuff in New York City is mostly the back of occult stores, weird spaces they've rented, rental like theater practice spaces. Like they're not great places, right? Like they're very well done. Like there's one specific temple, like the main Thelema group in New York City has a really beautiful space. But even then, like it's not like a church, right? It's not like they own like a whole church property. Like it's just occultists, like it's a small community, right? You don't have the donations to like open like a cathedral. Like it's just simply not a thing. But this group I went to had a really nice like high-rise type building, which was immediately strange to me because that is not anything I'd ever seen anywhere else. Like like we're talking about like parts of Brooklyn and parts of Queens, and the things that were in Manhattan that were occult related were always in like rental spaces. They were not in like owned spaces. But yes, this was like a high-end building in Manhattan. And so that was weird to me. And I didn't recognize a single person. And it was a lot of like, I don't know, it was just weird. And they were trying to charge people a lot of money. And that was immediately an ick to me. Like to go through this group, you have to pay for these classes that are like super expensive. Because generally occult classes in New York were like $15 max, and they were like recommended kind of mandatory donations, right? Like to go to a ritual in New York, you typically don't have to pay that much. You typically will have to like bring food or maybe donate like $20. Like it's not an expensive community to be part of. If you do like an initiation, like you'll have to like sometimes pay like a small fee for like the food afterwards, but like it's not, to be an occultist in New York City is not an expensive thing to do. I'm living in New York City now, that's expensive, but anything that asks for a lot of money is just not common. Like there was one occult shop in New York that did regular lectures where they had like visiting lecturers come, and those you'd have to pay to go to, but they were like $15, $20. I think the most I ever paid to go to a lecture was like 25, which for a high quality lecture that goes on for 3 hours from someone who's a really experienced occultist, I mean, that's fair. That's like the cost of a book. And at those lectures, I would learn, I mean, so much stuff. Like I remember I went to a really good like Solomonic magic lecture where it was so cool, right? And I learned a lot of things that I hold. But this Kabbalah thing, like to go, if I were to start actually going there, it would have been so much money. Like it was way out of my price range. And the stuff they were saying, like it was so weird. The one I went to, it was like intro lecture or something. They wouldn't even say the name God, which like if you know anything about Kabbalah, like you definitely have to talk about God. It was like really weird. Like they stripped it out of the religious context and were calling God the light. And that just was like culty as shit to me. Now, I don't know if this group is a cult. I'm not going to allege that, but it was weird. I think it was like to do the level, they had it in like levels, which is also kind of ick to me. I think it's normal to have like degrees or like marks of progression or some lectures that are only for more advanced practitioners or whatever. But to have it in like an explicit like level system where you have to pay to play, like that just rung me the really wrong way. And so I didn't pursue further with this group. And just generally, the lecture was so weird. It was so hippy dippy. I don't know what on earth it had to do with Kabbalah at all. Like this group seems to be Kabbalah in name only. Like there's really nothing about mysticism involved in this. And so that was like really weird. And it was just not it. I mean, I think they have that expensive building because people are paying so much to go there. And I remember I had a conversation with the girl who was sitting next to me at that class. She was like trying to become an actress or something. And I don't know if she's particularly spiritual or what, but it was just, just weird. The most new agey stuff that I ever did in New York was, of course, that thing, but I only went to that one time and then was immediately kind of like thrown off. Is I went to some yoga stuff, and yoga studios definitely skew a bit new agey. I went to the yoga studios that had things to do with spirituality because I'm not just interested in like pure stretching. I want like yoga, I believe, is a spiritual discipline. I do not think like secularizing yoga is good. And those obviously had a bit of a new agey hippy dippy vibe, but that's a yoga studio, right? That's to be expected. Like that's kind of the name of the game with people who are super into yoga. And so for that, like I don't have a problem with it. Like that's just kind of the people who spiritualize yoga, like whatever, who are in the West, not in India. Of course, in India, that's very different. But yeah, that was certainly weird. And the yoga studios were great. Like I really enjoyed. I went to yoga semi regularly. I went to this one that was like a more spiritually inclined yoga studio. The people were definitely a bit hippy dippy, new agey, but the actual yoga was really good. And so I was like definitely cool with that. Now, the other type of event that I went to is they had occasional like festivals where there would be like big pagan festivals where a bunch of groups would like set up tents. And if you live in a city, this is a good way to actually find people, is to go to these public festivals. Now, they're often pretty small. And I will say one of them had counter protesters, like people protesting paganism and occultism, like these like Christian counter protesters, which definitely killed the vibe a little bit because they were being like really annoying. Like I remember being very annoyed by them. And I don't have any problem with Christianity. Like I think Christianity has a rich occult tradition, but I don't like the type of Christians who show up at like a random pagan festival with their signs and just harass people. So these festivals were cool, but there was one that had a big counter protester presence, which was really, really annoying. Now at the events, like they were cool. I didn't tend to stay that long at them. I kind of like went through the tents and like talked to people and then dipped. Like I didn't spend all day at these things because they were often pretty small. Just in New York, like it's hard to get like a huge festival together. It's just logistically challenging. I'm sure pagan festivals in other places, I would have like spent more time at. But I mean, they were cool. Like these were cool events and you could meet people. And I noticed some of the smaller occult groups were just easier to find there. In general, finding occult groups has gotten harder because there was, when I first moved to New York, there was this awesome website called Witchvox that like listed all occult groups like everywhere. And like almost everyone was on there. I mean, there are of course some that weren't, but it was a very easy way to actually find community. And I found that once I was there long enough, and Witchvox actually was taken down because the people didn't want to keep running the website, which is such a shame. I really wish someone would take back over Witchvox. It became harder to find groups. You had to like go on websites like Facebook or sometimes even Meetup, which is like an event host website, and like find things. Or you had to go to these festivals or an occult shop and like look. There was one occult shop in New York that had like a pin, like a bulletin board with some flyers from different like groups. But yeah, some of them I saw for the first time at these festivals who I had never heard even existed. So there's a lot of groups in New York that are very small and kind of hard to find. I find that often when people are in New York trying to find groups, they run into the same few groups, right? Like a lot of the other groups are just hard to find. Like the longer things went on, you know, it was harder and harder to find things. And I don't think it's that the community has declined or gotten less popular or something. I think just generally, like, people were, I don't know. I don't know how to put it. Like, is it lower interest? No, I wouldn't say that it's lower interest. I don't think that's what it is. I think it's just because those social network things like Witchvox were decreasing and Facebook is being used less. Because a lot of the ways that occult groups would network were on Facebook, and a lot of people don't use Facebook anymore. And so I think the decline of Facebook also has to do with this. Occult listing events is kind of hard to do without a centralized website or something like Facebook that has like an event hosting thing. Or websites like Meetup. I know a lot of things have gone on to Meetup and Eventbrite. Those are still pretty viable to what I know. But yeah, it just became harder and harder to find things because the way the internet works now, like the internet is mostly social media. And so finding community is hard. You have to kind of like go to the main events and meet people and then discover these other groups. Like when I was leaving, like the last year I was there was a whole like group I'd never heard of that I discovered existed. Like it's just wild. And I think it's a shame that Witchvox doesn't exist as much. So yeah, I mean, those are a lot of my memories. I mean, there's obviously more stories I could tell about my time in New York, but that's a lot of what I experienced in a lot of my time there. And I mean, it was really great. I mean, I left New York because I wanted to enter a new chapter in my life, and I was kind of tired of city living, and some personal life stuff happened. Like I had a lot of things in my personal life change. Oh my God, my personal life did a 180. But yeah, I mean, it was a really cool time, and I'm glad I spent all that time and met all those people and had all those experiences. Even if I wasn't as close to it as some people were, and I still was fundamentally a solitary practitioner while living there. I mean, it was a great time in my life, and I think the community is a lot of really good people. Like, I have a lot of respect for the New York occult community, and yeah, love a lot of those people. A lot of those people are really cool. So if you want to find me, I'm under Georgina Rose or Dot Darling on every platform under the sun. This podcast is supported through Patreon. If you join the Patreon, you get a bonus episode 8 times a year. You get a pre-show episode with every episode. It's like a little mini pod. And yeah, you just get some cool stuff. So join the Patreon. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Have an amazing day, night, afternoon, mid-morning, mid-evening, whatever time, wherever it is you are. Bye!